Your ancestors risked drowning in poop just to keep their jobs, and some fought for the privilege of wiping the king's royal ass. Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding yourself in the middle of Tudor England somewhere between 1485 and 1603 with absolutely no money, no connections, and no clue how to survive in a world where career options basically meant picking which form of misery you preferred. Because trust me, the hidden history of this era was stuffed with the worst jobs in history, so vile and unbelievably disgusting, they'd make your worst Monday morning feel like a luxury vacation in the Bahamas. And that's not just me throwing around gross medieval facts for shock value, it's real documented history. And once you hear what some people actually did for a living, you might never look at your own job the same way again, because your choices would include standing knee-deep for 12 hours a day in fermented human urine that could literally dissolve the skin off your feet, or perhaps securing yourself a high-ranking position among the nobility whose glamorous-sounding duties consisted of nothing more than monitoring the king's bowel movements and personally wiping the royal backside, a position so coveted that actual dukes and earls schemed and battled to win it all for the political power that came with wiping royal poop. Or if you were lucky, you could snag the night shift crawling into cesspits so deep in toxic gas they regularly suffocated entire teams of workers. And before you think I'm exaggerating, just remember the true story of Richard the Raker, who climbed down into one of these pits and literally drowned in human waste, gone in a bubbling, reeking pool of sewage that swallowed him whole, because that was an actual hazard of employment in a world without modern sanitation. And today, I'm about to drag you through 12 of the most horrifying, mind-bogglingly revolting jobs from Tudor England. Each one a piece of hidden history that proves how absolutely savage and sometimes hilariously absurd the medieval workforce could be. So if you think your job sucks, buckle up and stay tuned, because by the end of this video, you'll be thanking your modern bathroom, and you just might find yourself obsessed with the shocking, dirty secrets that your history teacher definitely never told you about. And before you start thinking I'm just here spinning medieval horror stories for cheap shock value, let me tell you, right now, these weren't myths or random urban legends whispered in the dark corners of history books. These were real jobs done by real people day after day, year after year in Tudor England, and they're some of the most stomach-churning examples of hidden history and the worst jobs in history that you'll ever hear about. Because in this video, I'm about to reveal 12 actual professions, so vile, so soul-crushingly awful, they'd make modern office life look like an all-inclusive resort in the Maldives. And it's the kind of gross medieval facts that your teachers definitely never covered in school, the kind that make you want to gag, and also weirdly lean closer to hear more, because trust me, the deeper you go into these stories, the more you'll realize that having your boss email you at 3 AM is absolutely nothing compared to drowning in a cesspit, getting your feet burned off by ammonia-soaked urine, or being the guy officially in charge of documenting the royal poop schedule. And as much as these jobs were revolting, they were also deadly soul-destroying and weirdly tied into the power structures and social hierarchies of the time. And believe it or not, there were people who not only did these jobs, they fought for them, clawing their way into roles like groom of the stool for the chance to get closer to the king, because in a world where power was everything, even wiping royal butts could make or break your future. So stick around, because the first job on this list might sound harmless, but I promise you, by the time we're done, you'll be thanking the gods of modern plumbing that you were born in the 21st century, and you're definitely going to want to see which one of these 12 horrors claims the top spot as the absolute worst job in Tudor England. Number 1 on this nightmare list, and truly earning its place as possibly the single worst job in Tudor England, and maybe in all of human history, is the gong farmer. Because let's just say that if your worst day at work involves a grumpy boss or an overflowing email inbox, these guys would have traded places with you in half a heartbeat. Because picture this, it's 3 in the morning in 1547, London, the city's dark, the streets echo with silence except for the distant slosh of something wet and unspeakable. And while the rest of the city sleeps in blissful ignorance, one poor soul is climbing down into a cesspit armed with nothing but a shovel, a bucket, and the faint hope he might make it out alive. And this was the life of a gong farmer, a man whose entire existence revolved around hauling out the human waste that collected in vast underground pits beneath homes, taverns, and entire neighborhoods. A hidden history so filthy and shocking, it makes worst jobs in history list for a reason, because these cesspits didn't just smell like death. They produced toxic gases strong enough to suffocate a man where he stood, and the smell was so horrific that London law actually banned gong farmers from working during daylight hours so they wouldn't drive the entire population gagging into the Thames. And yet these men waded waist deep in human waste, shoveling excrement bucket by bucket, all for the princely sum of 2 shillings a night. And if that sounds bad enough, consider poor Richard the Raker, who one night slipped beneath the surface and quite literally drowned in raw sewage, lost forever in the depths of London's filth. And that's the kind of gross medieval fact they definitely didn't teach you in school. And while you might laugh at the absurdity, remember that gong farmers kept entire cities from drowning in their own waste, even if the job destroyed their health and guaranteed they'd die young, because between the toxic gases, the risk of drowning, and the countless diseases lurking in those pits, gong farmers had one of the highest mortality rates of any profession in Tudor England. So next time you're tempted to complain about your boss breathing down your neck, just remember it could be far, far worse. And speaking of worse, buckle up, because the next job on our list might seem a lot less disgusting at first glance, but trust me, it comes with a price that's equally horrifying in a very different way. Sliding into the number 2 spot, and yes, the pun is absolutely intended, is the legendary Groom of the Stool. A job title that sounds fancy enough to belong on royal stationery, but in reality revolved entirely around the king's bathroom habits. Because in the twisted hierarchy of Tudor England, even the worst jobs in history could come wrapped in velvet and dripping with hidden power. And this one was the ultimate paradox. Because while the Groom of the Stool's main duty was quite literally wiping the royal backside and maintaining the king's personal portable toilet or close stool, he simultaneously wielded enormous political influence, becoming one of the monarch's most trusted confidants. And the sheer insanity of that duality is the perfect example of how gross medieval facts often hide behind gilded curtains, because nobles actually fought, schemed, and pulled political strings for the chance to become the king's personal bathroom attendant. All because in an age where proximity to the sovereign meant everything, nobody was closer than the man who was literally there for every royal bowel movement. And it wasn't just a matter of handing over a clean cloth and calling it a day. The Groom of the Stool was expected to track the king's diet, keep meticulous records of his bowel movements, noting color, consistency, and frequency. And yes, those records still exist in dusty British archives, documenting things about Henry VIII that absolutely nobody needed to know. And while the job may sound ludicrous today, it was a coveted position that could launch a man into the highest circles of power, proving that in Tudor England, even wiping a royal butt could be a ticket to influence, because the groom could whisper in the king's ear at his most private moments, secure favors, and sway decisions that shaped the entire kingdom. So, next time you grumble about corporate meetings or tedious reports, just remember there was once a duke whose entire career hinged on how gently he wielded a linen cloth. And speaking of careers that required a unique set of, let's say, special skills, get ready, because the next job on our list plunges straight into a world of urine-fermented stink and the brutal realities of medieval textile production. Landing firmly in the number 3 spot on this grotesque countdown of hidden history and worst jobs in history is the fuller. And trust me when I say that if you thought wiping the king's royal behind was bad, just wait until you hear about people whose daily grind involved stomping around in human pee for hours on end. Because in Tudor England, the luxurious wool garments draping the nobility didn't just magically appear soft and spotless. Nope, they had to be painstakingly processed, and that process fell to the unfortunate souls known as fullers, whose entire job was to climb into giant vats brimming with stale human urine, because back then ammonia from fermented pea was the primary chemical strong enough to clean raw wool and strip away the greasy lanolin coating, so fullers would spend countless hours standing barefoot in vats of this rancid liquid, stomping and kneading the wool, while the overpowering fumes burned their eyes, seared their lungs, and quite literally dissolved the skin off their feet, a gross medieval fact that makes modern dry cleaning look like a 5-star spa. And it didn't stop there, because the smell was so horrific that fullers were legally banned from living within city limits to spare everyone else from the stench. And if that wasn't bad enough, they risked chronic respiratory issues, blistered skin, and lifelong health problems, all for wages so low they'd barely keep food on the table. And let's not forget that this foul job was often done by the poorest of the poor, including children as young as 6 or 7, who'd be up to their ankles in ammonia-laced urine, learning the trade that guaranteed them a lifetime of coughing fits and skin peeling off like old wallpaper. So next time you complain about a boring office job or a long retail shift, just picture some poor medieval kids sloshing around in pee to make your fancy doublet possible. And speaking of industries that practically weaponized human bodily fluids, stay right where you are, because the next job on our list will plunge us even deeper into the world of stench and color as we meet the workers responsible for producing that vibrant blue dye everyone in Tudor fashion craved, at a cost that came straight out of your worst nightmares. Coming in hot, or rather chokingly pungent, at number 4 in this wild ride through hidden history and the worst jobs in history is the woad dyer. And believe me, if you've ever rolled your eyes at an annoying workplace, smells like burnt microwave popcorn or stale coffee breath, you have absolutely no idea how lucky you are. Because in Tudor England, creating that gorgeous fashionable blue dye everyone craved meant standing for hours over massive vats of fermenting woad paste mixed with gallons of stale human urine. And yes, you heard that right, because in the world of gross medieval facts, few things come close to the horrors endured by woad dyers, who stirred these vile mixtures with long poles as clouds of toxic fumes rose into their faces, searing their lungs, burning their eyes, and dyeing their skin a sickly blue-green hue that marked them as social outcasts wherever they went. And the smell was so utterly indescribable that Queen Elizabeth Thurston herself banned woad dyeing operations from coming within 5 miles of any royal residence just to avoid the stench. And while the dye produced stunning deep blues that became the envy of Europe's fashion scene, the cost in human suffering was brutal, because woad dyers often went blind from prolonged exposure, developed chronic respiratory issues, and in many cases collapsed unconscious into the vats, either from sheer exhaustion or the suffocating fumes, leading to horrific accidents where some drowned in the very dye they'd been crafting. And even among other medieval tradespeople, woad dyers were shunned because nothing quite says social pariah like radiating the scent of fermented urine and chemical fumes 24 hours a day. So, next time you catch a whiff of something unpleasant at work, remember, it's nothing compared to the medieval workers who risked blindness burns and death just to give the nobility their fabulous blue robes. And speaking of jobs that demanded grueling labor under deadly conditions, brace yourself, because the next profession on our list steps out of the dye pits and into the roaring fires of royal kitchens, where young boys faced blistering heat and relentless cruelty, all for the sake of the king's legendary feasts. Sliding into the blisteringly hot number 5 spot on our savage tour of hidden history and the worst jobs in history is the Spit Boy. A job title that might sound vaguely heroic until you realize it involved children as young as 7 or 8, crouching half naked beside roaring fires in royal kitchens, endlessly turning massive spits loaded with joints of meat destined for the feasting tables of kings like Henry VIII. And let me tell you, if you think working overtime under fluorescent lights is bad, try working 18-hour shifts practically naked in temperatures well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, because these poor spit boys were responsible for ensuring every roast was cooked to perfection, spinning enormous wooden handles hour after punishing hour while sweat poured off their skin. And if they even so much as paused for a second, the meat would scorch, earning them a beating from furious cooks who had no patience for burnt venison. And while modern kitchen jobs might involve the occasional oil burn, these kids suffered blistered skin, searing heat, exhaustion, and raw hands rubbed bloody from the relentless motion, sometimes collapsing right beside the fire pits, only to be splashed with water, revived, and forced back to work because in the twisted hierarchy of Tudor England there was no such thing as child labour laws. And if that mental picture isn't brutal enough, imagine the sheer terror of standing so close to flames that your hair could catch fire, which is why many spit boys worked completely naked, all to keep the monarch's table heaped high with roasted delicacies. And it's one of those gross medieval facts that should make everyone profoundly grateful for modern kitchen tech like rotisserie motors and health inspectors, because nobody should ever have to risk third-degree burns just so a king can enjoy his goose cooked evenly on all sides. So, the next time your boss asks you to stay late, remember it's still better than working as a spit boy in the palace kitchens. And speaking of workplaces that were practically chemical weapons in disguise, strap in, because the next job on our list takes us from roasting fires to the bubbling vats of London streets where men battled mountains of filth in a daily war against disease and death. Charging straight into the number 6 spot on this jaw-dropping parade of hidden history and worst jobs in history comes the raker, a man whose job quite literally meant wading through rivers of human waste, rotting food, and dead animals in the filthy streets of Tudor London. And if you've ever griped about cleaning your bathroom or taking out the garbage, let me assure you, those chores have nothing on what these poor souls endured, because imagine the worst public restroom you've ever seen, multiply that stench by 1,000, spread it over several square miles, and you're getting close to the daily reality of a raker who was tasked with scraping up layer upon layer of revolting filth from city streets that had no sewers and no garbage collection, and everything, absolutely everything, was tossed out, windows into the street, from chamber pots brimming with waste to the carcasses of dead pets. And while that alone sounds bad enough factor in that on a good day, the streets were ankle deep in muck, and on a rainy day it could easily reach your knees, which is why rakers started their shifts before dawn, wielding long-handled rakes and pushing heavy carts that leaked putrid slime everywhere they went. And besides dodging disease, they also had to be vigilant for chamber pots raining down unexpectedly from above, because Londoners weren't shy about emptying their waste straight onto the streets, sometimes landing directly on the unlucky raker's head. And let's not even get started on the horrors of moving dead horses that could bloat to twice their size and burst apart in a shower of maggots and foul-smelling flesh, and all this for wages so low that rakers often scavenged the filth for anything remotely valuable just to survive, making them a unique breed of medieval sanitation, worker meets treasure hunter. So, next time you're tempted to whine about a messy office kitchen, remember the raker who risked drowning in filth so London didn't drown in its own waste. And speaking of men forced into disgusting jobs for the sake of national security, brace yourself, because the next profession on our list involves royal warrants, angry homeowners, and the bizarre quest to dig up gunpowder ingredients from the floors of unsuspecting citizens' homes. Storming into the chaotic number 7 slot on this wild ride through hidden history and the worst jobs in history is the saltpeter man, whose profession combined government authority, chemical extraction, and enough public outrage to fuel an entire medieval riot. Because while you might think your modern job comes with annoying customers or invasive bosses, at least nobody shows up waving a royal warrant demanding to tear up your living room floor in search of gunpowder ingredients, because that's precisely what the saltpeter men did in Tudor England, where the crown desperately needed saltpeter, a crucial component of gunpowder, but lacked natural deposits. So instead, they created a profession whose entire purpose was to raid private homes, barns, stables, and even churches, looking for nitrate-rich earth where organic waste had been decomposing for years. And if that sounds invasive, imagine these men crashing through your door, royal document in hand, ripping apart your stone floors or wooden planks and leaving gaping holes behind for you to repair on your own dime, and all because beneath your floorboards might be precious soil that could be turned into explosive powder, and while the saltpeter men were legally untouchable, paid by how much dirt they collected, that didn't stop furious homeowners from attacking them with farming tools, or entire villages banding together to chase them off with sticks and stones, making this job not only filthy and physically grueling, but downright dangerous. And though they were seen as vital to national security, they were universally despised because few things destroy neighborhood relations faster than government-sanctioned floor demolition, and eventually the profession died out when England began importing saltpeter from India in the 17th century, sparing countless Tudor homes from being ripped apart. So, next time you complain about someone coming to read your gas meter, remember the saltpeter men who could legally turn your house into a crater in the name of national defense. And speaking of jobs that force people to risk their lives amid deadly epidemics, buckle up, because the next job on our list steps straight into plague-infested homes where death was lurking behind every door and survival was anything but guaranteed. Stalking grimly into the number 8 spot on this brutal countdown of hidden history and the worst jobs in history comes the plague searcher, a profession so terrifying and tragic that it makes even gong farmers look like they had it easy, because while most people were barricading themselves inside their homes and praying desperately not to catch the Black Death, these brave or perhaps desperate souls were out there knocking on plague-infested doors, all for the grand sum of 4p per corpse, because in plague-ravaged London, the authorities needed someone to determine who died of the plague and who hadn't. So they hired elderly women from the poorest classes who had zero medical training, whose only qualification was quite morbidly having seen a lot of dead bodies. And these plague searchers would march into houses where the air was thick with the reek of sickness and death, examining corpses for telltale signs like blackened fingers, swollen buboes, and bloody froth, risking infection with every breath because, let's be real, medieval PPE didn't exist, and these women went in with no masks, no gloves, and nothing but sheer necessity driving them, making this one of the gross medieval facts that's both horrifying and heartbreaking, because not only did they risk dying themselves, they were also universally despised, blamed for spreading the disease further, and often found themselves bribed or even threatened by desperate families who didn't want their loved ones labeled as plague victims and their homes quarantined. And if the bribes didn't work, sometimes violence did, turning this job into a lethal gamble between deadly microbes and angry townsfolk. And while the profession lingered well into the 17th century, it finally faded out by 1836, when laws required proper medical certification of death, sparing future generations this horrific career path. So the next time you're frustrated by workplace hazards like paper cuts or ergonomic chairs gone rogue, remember the women who faced the Black Death armed with nothing but their eyes and a shilling or two. And speaking of jobs that combined physical danger, animal cruelty, and the constant risk of being ripped apart, brace yourself, because the next entry on our list drags us straight into the bloody roaring chaos of Tudor England's favourite brutal pastime. Roaring into the ferocious number 9 slot on this twisted journey through hidden history and the worst jobs in history is the bearwood, a profession that proves once and for all that Tudor England was absolutely unmatched when it came to mixing bloodsport, animal cruelty, and mortal danger into one chaotic job description. Because if you thought wrestling spreadsheets were stressful, imagine being the guy responsible for managing a massive muscle-bound bear, whose sole purpose was to entertain screaming crowds in bear baiting pits, which back then was as popular as football is today. And the bearwood's nightmare began with acquiring bear cubs and raising them not as cute cuddly creatures, but as savage snarling monsters systematically brutalized, starved and tormented until they were angry enough to fight for their lives. And before every show, the bearwood would file down the bear's teeth and trim its claws, not out of mercy, but purely so the bloody spectacle would last longer for the delighted crowd. And on fight days, this poor soul had to chain the bear to a stake in the center of the ring, unleash packs of dogs on it, and then stand there in the middle of the chaos, making sure the chain didn't snap, while occasionally poking the bear with a sharp stick if it wasn't performing violently enough. which is one of those gross medieval facts that makes modern sports look downright wholesome. And if you think that sounds insane, consider that more than one Bearwood was mauled to death by his own bear because bears are smart. They remember who beat them, and eventually some of them decided they'd had enough, leaving their tormentor as a shredded cautionary tale in the bloody sand of the pit. And while bear baiting finally died out in 1835, ending this horrific chapter of entertainment history, it's a stark reminder that in Tudor England, a dream job could come with teeth claws and a thirst for revenge. So next time your boss growls at you, remember, it's probably better than being dragged to death by an enraged grizzly. And speaking of jobs soaked in blood trauma and a close-up view of royal justice, buckle up, because the next profession on our list involved preparing axes, collecting severed heads, and preserving human remains in the grisliest way imaginable. Crashing headfirst into the grisly number 10 slot on this spine-chilling tour of hidden history and the worst jobs in history is the executioner's assistant, a profession that sounds dramatic enough in itself but gets way darker once you realize that while everyone remembers the flourish of the axe and the crowd's collective gasp, almost nobody stops to think about the poor soul stuck doing all the horrifying prep and equally horrifying cleanup, because being an executioner's assistant in Tudor England meant your entire working life revolved around decapitations, disembowelments, and a front row seat to the kingdom's bloodiest spectacles. And let's just say that if you thought your job was messy, try having to sharpen a giant axe to the perfect lethal edge. Not too sharp, or it might chip on the block. Not too dull, or it could take multiple whacks, which, trust me, nobody wanted, especially after the royal fiasco of botched beheadings. And it was this assistant's job to bind the prisoners' hands, help position them on the chopping block, and sometimes even hold them still as they trembled in terror, because nothing screams worst job ever quite like having to physically restrain someone moments before your boss chops off their head. And the horror didn't end with the blade falling either, because next came the grotesque task of dealing with the severed head itself, which wasn't simply buried out of sight, but instead was retrieved parboiled with salt and cumin to preserve it, then slathered in tar to keep it from rotting before being stuck on a spike for public display. A gross medieval fact that proves how utterly savage justice was back then, and if you were unlucky enough to assist with traitors, forget a quick beheading. Those poor assistants had to handle hangings, disembowelments, while the victim was still alive, quarterings, and all manner of gruesome tasks that would send even the toughest stomachs heaving. So next time you're annoyed about cleaning the office fridge, remember the men who literally had to handle human heads for a living. And speaking of jobs that demanded intense focus and microscopic precision, stay tuned, because the next profession on our list may seem deceptively harmless, but beneath its tiny metallic surface lay blindness, arthritis, and a lifetime of agony. Sneaking into the deceptively unassuming number 11 slot on this brutal journey through hidden history and the worst jobs in history is the handpin maker, a profession that might sound harmless at first glance. After all, what could possibly be so terrifying about making tiny little pins? But trust me, this seemingly innocent trade was a silent destroyer of bodies, eyes, and entire childhoods, because in Tudor England, pins weren't mass-produced by machines. Like they are today, each pin had to be painstakingly crafted by hand through an exhausting process of no fewer than 18 separate steps, starting with straightening brass wire, cutting it into perfect lengths, filing one end, razor-sharp hammering on a delicate wire head, and then dumping the lot into bags filled with chalk and brown dust, which the workers had to shake for hours to achieve a polished finish. And while that might sound merely tedious, consider the reality that the dust got absolutely everywhere, filling lungs, coating eyes, clinging to hair, leaving workers coughing up brass particles and developing what doctors called brass founder's ague, which was probably heavy metal poisoning. And if that wasn't enough, a skilled handpin maker was expected to produce up to 4,000 pins a day, which meant performing the same tiny precise motions thousands of times until their joints seized up, their vision blurred, and arthritis twisted their fingers into permanent agonizing claws. And here's the kicker, pay for this brutal labor was literal pennies, not nearly enough to live on. which is why entire families, including children as young as 4 or 5, were drafted into the trade with their small fingers considered perfect for delicate work. So by the age of 10, many kids were already working full shifts, and by 30, most were half-blind, crippled, and completely expendable. Making this one of those gross medieval facts that should make anyone grateful for modern factories and labor laws. So, next time you moan about typing reports all day, remember the generations of kids who went blind, making the tiny pins that held Tudor England's clothes together. And speaking of jobs that required constant vigilance and dealing with unexpected chaos, get ready, because our final job on this list involves a whip, a church full of nobles, and a pack of unruly dogs that could turn holy services into pure bedlam. Barking its way into the utterly bizarre number 12 spot on this marathon through hidden history and the worst jobs in history is the dog whipper, a job title that sounds like something out of a Monty Python skit, but was very, very real in Tudor England, because in a time when church services were a major social event and people packed into pews shoulder to shoulder, they apparently thought it was a perfectly good idea to bring along their dogs. Meaning that while the priest tried to deliver a solemn sermon, Lady Patton's lapdog might be yapping hysterically at Farmer John's sheepdog, the blacksmith's enormous mastiff might be lifting his leg on a pillar, and a couple of terriers could be locked in mortal combat over some unidentifiable dead thing under the bench, and into this canine chaos strode the dog whipper, armed with a long whip and a pair of wooden tongs, whose job it was to patrol the aisles mid-service, springing into action at the first bark, yelp or growl, snapping the whip or snaring misbehaving dogs around the neck. And here's the viral-worthy twist. His authority didn't stop at dogs, because if unruly children started squirming, if young couples got a little too cozy, or if anyone dared nod off during the sermon, the dog whipper might give them a sharp crack of the whip as well, making him the medieval equivalent of a bouncer crossed with an animal control officer. And while the job sounds comedic, it was surprisingly dangerous, because whipping the local squire's favorite hunting dog was a fast track to losing not just your job, but possibly a few teeth, courtesy of the dog's furious owner, and records exist of dog whippers being bitten, attacked, and even chased out of towns for daring to lay a whip on the wrong canine. And though the position lingered into the Victorian era, it finally vanished, as people collectively realized that bringing dogs into church probably wasn't the best idea. So the next time your boss hands you a weird assignment, remember it could be worse. You could have been the guy responsible for keeping a medieval church from turning into a barking, snarling circus. And speaking of circuses, stick around, because what comes next ties together everything we've covered and proves that even the most disgusting jobs in history left behind lessons and sometimes even secrets that still shape our world today. And there you have it, the 12 most jaw-droppingly vile, downright soul-crushing and bizarrely fascinating jobs from Tudor England, the kind of hidden history that reminds us that while we might complain about emails, office politics, or soul-sucking Monday meetings, at least we're not waist-deep in human waste, boiling human heads for royal display, or dodging rabid dogs during Sunday service, because the truth is these weren't just gross medieval facts designed to make you gag. They were real livelihoods that kept society running, often at horrific costs to the people trapped in them. And while it's easy to laugh at the sheer absurdity of jobs like groom of the stool or the dog whipper, there's something powerfully humbling in knowing that entire generations endured unspeakable hardships so that modern life could exist as it does today. So, the next time you're cursing under your breath about your boss, your spreadsheet, or that never-ending Zoom call, remember the gong farmers who risked drowning in sewage so your ancestors didn't drown in filth, or the feelers stomping in vats of ammonia-soaked urine so people could wear fine wool, and let that little piece of hidden history put your worst workday into perspective, because while the jobs might be gone, the lesson still stands that human beings have always been willing to do the unimaginable to survive, and that's equal parts horrifying and inspiring. And if you enjoyed this wild plunge into the worst jobs in history, do me one massive favor, hit that like button so YouTube knows you love hidden history as much as I do. smash that subscribe button so you don't miss the next video where we'll dig into even more shocking truths your teachers definitely skipped, and drop a comment below telling me which of these jobs you'd absolutely refuse to do, even if your life depended on it. Or hey, maybe you're twisted enough to pick a favorite and save this video to remind yourself on your next bad work day that it could always be worse, because when you're armed with the knowledge of history's darkest, weirdest corners, you'll never look at your modern 9 to 5 quite the same again. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next, because the hidden history rabbit hole goes way deeper than anyone ever told you.